The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer, 2,400 lumens of white that made shadows impossible and sleep difficult. Katie Morrison had learned to work inside that hum without hearing it, the way a submariner learns to ignore the groaning of hull steel at depth. Night shift at Oak Creek Memorial stretched from 1900 to 0700, 11 hours of controlled chaos and the particular loneliness that only exists in hospitals after visiting hours end. She moved through the corridors with the efficiency of someone who had memorized every hallway, every supply closet, every dead space where you could stand still for 30 seconds and breathe. Smell of stale coffee mixed with antiseptic. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white ceiling. The stretcher wheel squeaked against linoleum as she guided a post-op patient back to their room, hands steady, movements economical, nothing wasted. Nobody looked up when she passed. That was intentional. That was survival. The emergency department crackled with the particular energy of Friday night, drunk college kid with a split forehead, elderly woman clutching her chest, a construction worker whose thumb was definitely not supposed to bend that direction. Katie had processed all three in the triage waiting area before the day shift even finished their handoff. One of the day nurses, Michelle, caught her arm as she headed toward Trauma Bay 3. "How do you do that?" Michelle asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of 8 hours of administrative chaos. Katie just shook her head. "Do what?" She didn't say, 12 years of combat medicine. Didn't say, Baghdad taught me to assess wounds while mortars landed. Didn't say, I've triaged 63 soldiers bleeding out in a forward operating base and you're asking me how I'm handling drunk college kids. Instead she said, just paying attention. Michelle laughed, but her eyes held uncertainty. People could sense it. Some occupational competence that didn't match the paperwork. Katie had learned to minimize it. Keep her head down. Blend. Dr. Richard Sterling arrived at 1923 hours for the weekend shift, his designer shoes clicking against the tile with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in a room. He was 38, tall in the way privilege manufactures, expensive haircut, that particular grooming of someone for whom appearance is a life skill. His father sat on the hospital board. His brother-in-law's law firm handled the hospital's litigation. He had 7 residents who needed his favor for their letters of recommendation, and he'd learned long ago that fear was cheaper than respect. He moved through the ER with a surgeon's precision that was purely theatrical, hands gesturing to indicate points of brilliance, voice pitched high enough to ensure his observations were never missed by the audience of younger doctors who orbited his presence like satellites around a planet. Katie watched him from the supply room as he swept into Trauma Bay 1, where a genuine emergency was unfolding. 42-year-old male, chest trauma, 2 ribs broken, left pneumothorax just beginning to collapse the lung. Michelle had called him down, and now he stood at the patient's bedside looking at the monitor display with the critical expression of someone solving a physics equation. Katie had already assessed the patient during triage. Knew exactly what the problem was. Watched as Sterling spent for minutes explaining to his residents why the patient's oxygen saturation was declining before actually doing anything about it. She didn't flinch. Didn't roll her eyes. Just reshelved the 18-gauge angiocath needles and moved on to the next room. The break room at 2,347 hours was the small circular space where Oak Creek Memorial's mythology took shape, not in medical journals or board meetings, but in the conversations between shifts. Sterling had already claimed the best chair, the one near the window that overlooked the parking lot. 3 residents circled him like courtiers, and he was mid-story about some complication he'd heroically managed when Katie walked in to grab her dinner from the refrigerator. Microwaved burrito. Black coffee. She was heading back out when Sterling's voice cut across the room. So did you see the new hire? He didn't say her name. That was deliberate. Katie kept walking. Overconfident type. I give her 1 week before the pressure gets to her. Anyone want to bet? One of the residents laughed nervously. Another checked his phone. Sterling smiled, the smile of a man who'd just thrown down a gauntlet and knew nobody would pick it up. Not yet. He was still building his mythology, establishing dominance. In combat, Katie had learned, hierarchy was established through demonstrated competence. In civilian institutions, she was discovering, it was established through the willingness to publicly humiliate those beneath you. Sterling was very good at that. The comatose patient in Trauma 3 had arrived 8 hours earlier, John Doe, no identification, no emergency contacts, no medical history available. Male, approximately 32 years old, brought in by ambulance after being found unconscious on the 163 overpass with blunt force trauma to the head. Likely assault. The police had taken a report. Nobody knew who he was. He lay on the hospital bed like a question without an answer, his body hooked to monitors and 4 lines, the steady beat of his heart the only thing preventing silence. Beside him, on the metal side table, lay a pair of boots. Military issue. Army Ranger Desert Tan, scuffed and worn and caked with dust that looked older than memory. The laces were still tied, someone had removed them carefully. And draped around the patient's neck, hanging against his bare chest beneath the hospital gown, was a metal badge on a worn cord. An Army Ranger scroll. Crossed musket and bayonet. The insignia of soldiers who rappel from helicopters and clear rooms and move through darkness with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators. Katie was checking the patients for drip when she saw it. Her hands froze. 1 second. 2 seconds. The rest of the world tilted sideways and then righted itself. She forced her hands to move. Checked the saline flow rate. Checked the monitor strip. Checked the notes in the chart, all standard coma protocol, nothing requiring immediate intervention. But her eyes kept drifting back to that badge. That specific badge. She hadn't seen one in person since 2004. Hadn't let herself think about the specific weight of one hanging around her neck, cool metal against her collarbone, back when she'd worn the rank that came with it. Back when she'd had a name that meant something. Back when she'd pulled children from rubble in Baghdad with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. She left the room before the memory could surface completely. That was the skill Katie had perfected over 2 decades. The moment the past tried to surface, that moment when her chest would tighten and her vision would narrow and she could almost hear the mortar fire again, she would simply choose not to follow it. Push down. Keep moving. 17 years she'd been out of the Navy. 17 years since she'd put her Glock 19 in her mouth in that Coronado apartment and decided, at the last possible second, that the war was going to end differently. Not with a bang in that darkness. Not like that. She was going to walk away and become someone else. Someone unremarkable. Someone safe. Someone broken in ways nobody could quantify or measure or weaponize. Katie Morrison. Night shift nurse. Invisible. The monitor in Trauma 3 beeped its steady rhythm, sinus rhythm, normal. The patient's vital signs were stable. His breathing synchronized with the ventilator in that mechanical dance of survival. And Katie moved on to her next room without looking back, her hands performing their practiced work, her mind carefully compartmentalized into sections that would never connect with each other. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in the back of her consciousness, buried beneath 17 years of deliberate forgetting, she recognized something about that face. Something in the angle of the cheekbones, the shape of the jaw. And she couldn't let herself follow that thought either. Wouldn't allow her memory to construct the bridge that connected the 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from the rubble in Fallujah to the unconscious man lying in her hospital bed with combat boots beside him and a Ranger scroll pressed against his ribs. That way led to questions. That way led to the past breaking through the carefully constructed walls of her present. That way led nowhere Katie Morrison was willing to go. She checked on the patient once more before the shift ended at 0700, standing in the doorway with her hand on the frame, looking at this stranger who carried the proof of a life she'd erased. The boots. The badge. The silence. Somewhere in this hospital, Dr. Richard Sterling was beginning his morning rounds, establishing his dominance, and Katie was about to discover exactly how far a man would go to protect the hierarchy that kept him untouchable. She had no idea what was about to happen. No idea that this patient would be the trigger that brought every carefully buried truth crashing back into the light. She just knew that she needed to move forward, one shift at a time, and pretend that some ghosts were better left sleeping. The cafeteria smelled like industrial chicken broth and desperation. Katie stood in line with a tray holding a salad she wouldn't eat and coffee she'd already drained twice, watching the orderlies wipe tables with the efficiency of people who'd stopped caring about the stains. Third night in a row. Her scrub still held the antiseptic reek of the trauma bay, that sharp chemical bite that never quite washed out. Dr. Richard Sterling sat 3 tables over with 5 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish around a shark. He laughed at something one of them said, the kind of laugh that required an audience to be complete. His tie was silk. His watch was silver. His hands had probably never held a suction catheter without someone else preparing it first. Katie kept her eyes on her tray and moved toward an empty table in the corner. The angle of her walk, the way her shoulders held, these were choices she made conscious. Soft. Deferential. The kind of person who belonged in the corners of rooms, not the center. She didn't see Sterling move. That was the problem with people who'd never trained for combat. They telegraphed everything, their bodies screaming their intentions 3 seconds before their hands caught up. But Sterling had institutional power instead. He had momentum. He had an audience he'd already convinced he was untouchable. His elbow connected with her tray at precisely the right angle. The salad went first, an explosion of lettuce and dressing across the tile floor. The coffee cup followed, shattering against the base of a chair with a sound like breaking glass. Sterling's residents laughed. One of them actually pointed. The sound in the cafeteria didn't stop, people just bent their heads lower and pretended not to see a woman on her knees gathering scattered pieces of a plastic plate. Clumsy, Sterling said. His voice carried the weight of someone used to people nodding at his observations. You should probably focus on where you're going, Morrison. Liability and all that. Katie knelt. The tile was still wet from the morning cleaning, cold against her knees. She felt the weight of 30 seconds of silence, that strange gravity that happens when one person absorbs humiliation and everyone else holds their breath. Her hands moved. Piece by piece. Lettuce. Broken ceramic. The coffee spreading toward the baseboards like spilled blood. One measured breath. That was the rule. One breath, then the rest of her voice came back. She rose. The tray was half reconstructed, enough. She stood there for exactly 2 seconds with the pieces in her hands, and when she looked up at Sterling, something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, that she'd made eye contact. That she hadn't flinched into apology. I'll grab another, she said. Her voice was level. I'm sure it's just a mistake. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours later, during rounds, Sterling handed her a chart. A patient in bed for post-op cardiac, elevated troponin levels spiking on the last set of labs. The numbers weren't subtle, 0.47, 0.52, climbing. His EKG showed subtle ST changes. The patient needed a cardiologist evaluation within the hour. The window for intervention was closing like a door closing on someone's chest. Katie held the chart steady. She read the labs. She understood what the numbers meant, what they always meant. Crisis. Time-sensitive. Now. She looked up to tell him, and Sterling's hand came open. The chart fell to the floor. Pages scattered across the tile in slow motion, each sheet landing like a defeat. Vital signs. Imaging reports. The EKG strip curled against the baseboard. Pick that up, sweetheart, Sterling said. He didn't raise his voice. That was the genius of it, he didn't need to. The residents heard him fine. The nurses at the med station heard him fine. Everyone heard him. Katie stood there. Not trembling. Not flinching. Just standing while the world arranged itself differently around her, the white fluorescent light suddenly too bright, the beeping of 12 different monitors suddenly too loud, the smell of antiseptic suddenly too much like blood. One measured breath. She let a single tear escape. Just one. She didn't blink it back, she didn't hide it. She let it track down her cheek while holding Sterling's eyes, and then, very slowly, she wiped it away with the back of her hand without looking down. Without breaking contact. "When you kill that patient with your ego," she said, "I'll make sure the family knows exactly why." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Long enough for her to kneel and gather the scattered pages. Long enough for Sterling's jaw to tighten. Long enough for one of his residents to actually step back, realizing that something fundamental had shifted in the room's gravity. She collected every page. The troponin results. The EKG. The admission notes. She stacked them carefully, her hand steady, her movements precise. She did not hurry. She did not apologize. She rose, held the chart against her chest, and said, "I'm taking this to cardiology now, Dr. Sterling. Before the patient deteriorates any further." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of someone who'd given orders before. Sterling's face darkened. "I don't appreciate your tone, Morrison. It seems like you're catastrophizing." She didn't smile. Her voice had dropped a register, something happening in the lower frequencies that had nothing to do with volume. "Showing concern for patient outcomes? That's exactly what I'm doing." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the middle of rounds with his authority hanging in the air like a question mark. The residents exchanged glances. One of them actually made a note in her own chart, not a clinical note, but the kind of note people make when they've decided something important about a person. Sterling's jaw worked. He wanted to continue, but Katie was already moving through the doorway, already speaking to the cardiology fellow on the phone, already moving the patient's crisis forward through sheer force of will and clinical precision. He couldn't catch her in a mistake if she was making all the right calls. What he didn't know was that this was exactly the moment he'd needed to stop. This was his last chance to back away, to pretend the bet was stupid, to integrate Katie Morrison into the hospital hierarchy as a competent nurse who knew her place. Instead, he made his choice. By morning, Sterling had called 3 board members. By afternoon, he'd contacted the nursing director with concerns about her references. By evening, he'd brought in an external investigator, a consultant who'd never met Katie, who'd never seen her place a line or talk down a panicking family member, who had nothing but Sterling's narrative and a stack of charts to review. The machinery of institutional power was already in motion. Katie worked her shift like nothing had changed. She checked vitals. She documented carefully. She moved through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial with the same quiet competence that had made Sterling nervous in the first place. But she could feel the weight settling on her shoulders, the specific gravity of being watched. Of being investigated. Of being dismantled from the inside out, one chart at a time. The patient in bed lived. The cardiologist caught the rising troponin in time. There was an intervention. There was recovery. But Sterling didn't mention that when he spoke to the board members. He mentioned only that Katie had catastrophized a routine post-op presentation, that she'd been insubordinate, that she'd questioned his clinical judgment in front of residents. None of it was a lie, exactly. But none of it was true either. The night wore on. The hospital breathed its mechanical breath, ventilators and monitors, the shuffle of exhausted staff, the particular silence that settles over a building when most of the city is sleeping. Katie sat in the break room at 3:42 a.m. with a cup of terrible coffee and a phone that hadn't rang, understanding that the game had changed. That she was no longer the new nurse who knew her place. She was something else now. Something Sterling had decided was a threat. She didn't know what was coming. Not yet. But the rain was starting to fall outside, and somewhere in the darkness, the machinery of consequence was already turning. Midnight. The ventilator's wheeze flatlined into a single, piercing alarm. Katie's head snapped up from the medication cart at the sound, the kind of alarm that doesn't come back from silence. Trauma 3. Her body moved before her brain finished the thought, muscle memory shortcutting rational decision-making. The monitor showed what the alarm already knew, John Doe's oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 88, 82, 76, The collapsed lung had finally decided to betray him completely. She was in the room in 7 seconds. The student nurse standing beside the bed, Marcus, second rotation, still learning how to read a crisis, turned toward her with the blank panic of someone watching a patient die without permission to do anything about it. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle," Katie said. Not a question. The voice came out different somehow. Lower. Sharper. The voice of someone who had made this exact call before, in a field hospital in Baghdad with IED shrapnel decorating the walls. "Should I page Dr. Sterling?" "He won't come." Katie was already assessing the chest wall, her fingers moving across John Doe's rib cage with the precision of someone who had done this in darkness, in sand, in the smell of diesel and copper. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The spot was exactly where it had always been. The procedure hadn't changed in 20 years. Neither had the consequence. The phone in her pocket vibrated. She could feel it against her thigh. Sterling, finally. She pulled it out one-handed while running her other palm across John Doe's chest wall, marking landmarks her hands remembered from another lifetime. "He's decompensating," she said before Sterling could speak. "Tension pneumothorax. I need authorization for needle decompression." The pause on the other end stretched long enough to watch another O2 reading drop. 72, Sterling's voice came back measured, dismissive, the tone of a man defending territory that had nothing to do with medicine. "You're catastrophizing again, Morrison. The chest X-ray was stable 6 hours ago. These things don't progress that rapidly. The pressure is compressing his heart. If I don't decompress in the next 90 seconds, he codes. Call radiology. Order another film. I'm not driving in at midnight because you had a feeling." Katie disconnected. Not hung up. Disconnected. The word choice mattered. She set the phone on the tray table and looked at Marcus, whose hands had started shaking the moment he understood what was about to happen. "I need that needle now." "But he said." "I know what he said." Katie's voice had dropped another register, the way it used to drop in field hospitals when the mortars started walking closer. "He's wrong. The needle. Now." Marcus moved like he'd been shot forward. The needle appeared in her hand, and Katie didn't think about authorization or protocol or the 17 different ways this decision could destroy her career. Her hands had held this needle before. In Fallujah. In the dust. When a 7-year-old boy with an Army Ranger father had come through their field station with shrapnel in his lung and a mother who'd already bled out at the checkpoint. She'd saved that boy. She'd handed him to the evacuation bird and never let herself think about what happened after. Her hands knew what to do. They moved without permission from the conscious part of her brain that had spent 20 years learning how to be invisible. She prepped the skin with antiseptic, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the hospital's institutional blandness. Found the space between the ribs where they belonged. Felt the anatomical landmarks the way a musician feels the strings under their fingers. One smooth motion. The needle went in through the chest wall, through the layer of connective tissue, and into the pleural space where air was suffocating the boy's lung. The hiss of air escaping followed immediately, pressure bleeding out like a scream finally permitted. The monitor responded before the breath left her lungs. O2 climbing. 68, 75. 82, 88. 92, stable. The heart rate came down next. The blood pressure followed like someone setting down a weight they'd been holding too long. John Doe's face shifted from the slack grey of hypoxia into something approaching human again, and Katie realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From muscle memory reawakening in her body like something with its own heartbeat. She stepped back from the bed. Looked down at her hands. They were still holding the needle. Still remembering Baghdad. Still knowing exactly how to keep people alive when the system around them was collapsing. What just happened? Marcus's voice cracked somewhere between question and accusation. Triage protocol, Katie said quietly, her voice still carrying that resonance from another life. Tension pneumothorax requires immediate decompression. The alternative was cardiac arrest. She was already moving to the monitor, checking the readings, her fingers moving with the kind of careful precision that made people stop asking questions. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm again, a sound like relief with a mechanical accent. John Doe's chest rose and fell with oxygen finally reaching where it belonged. What they didn't know was that Katie Morrison had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The procedure was textbook emergency medicine, the kind taught in every critical care course. But the hands that had performed it carried a muscle memory that predated this hospital by 2 decades. The way she'd moved. The terminology she'd used. The absolute certainty that had made her voice drop an octave and cut through protocol like a blade through silk. Those things belonged to someone else. Someone she'd buried under 20 years of night shifts and anonymity. Marcus stared at her like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize standing in the same nurse's body. "Get a portable chest film," Katie said. "And get Dr. Sterling on the phone. Tell him the procedure is done and John Doe is stable." Not a suggestion. Tell him. She walked out of Trauma 3 without waiting for confirmation. The hallway stretched in front of her with its fluorescent lights flickering their persistent him. Her hands were still shaking. The combat badge hung around John Doe's neck where she'd seen it when she entered the room, the Army Ranger insignia catching light like a secret finally allowed to exist in the open. She'd seen that insignia before. She'd placed more like it on soldiers who didn't make it out of Fallujah. In the break room, 3 nurses looked up from their night shift collapse. Their eyes registered nothing. But Katie saw the moment one of them, Sarah, the ER veteran from Camp Lejeune, recognized something in the way Katie moved. The precision. The authority. The kind of competence that didn't come from textbooks and shift rotations. Katie filled a cup with coffee she didn't want. Looked at the cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" sitting in the cabinet where she'd left it that morning. 20 hours ago, she'd been invisible. 20 hours from now, she suspected that status would become either reinforced or catastrophically revoked. The phone on the unit desk rang. "Sterling." Sarah answered, listened, hung up without saying a word. She turned to Katie with an expression that suggested she'd just watched someone step out from behind a curtain that had been drawn for a very long time. "He wants a full report on the procedure," Sarah said. "And he wants it documented. Every step." Katie nodded. Documented. Which meant on the record. Which meant the security footage would be pulled. Which meant Sterling would see exactly how far outside protocol she'd gone, and how little she'd cared about crossing that boundary when a patient's heart was about to stop. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, hammering against the hospital's windows like it was demanding entry. Somewhere in that sound was a clock counting down. Katie could hear it even if nobody else could. The moment when comfortable anonymity transformed into something else entirely. Something that couldn't stay hidden much longer. She looked back toward Trauma 3, where John Doe was breathing oxygen that had reached his lungs because her hands remembered how to save him. A grown man's lungs. The lungs of someone who'd been 7 years old in a courtyard in Baghdad, clutching his father's combat boots, waiting for someone to tell him whether his mother was coming back. Katie had told him yes then. She hadn't expected the universe to give her the chance to tell him again. Sterling arrived at 12:53 a.m. with the security footage already queued on his phone. The hallway outside Trauma 3 was empty except for the soft whisper of the ventilator keeping John Doe stable, O2 sat 94, climbing from the 68 it had been when Katie had moved. No authorization. No call to him first. No permission. He stood in the doorway, watching the monitors tick upward like a betrayal, and made his first call at 1:13 a.m. Board member Hayes answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep that evaporated the moment Sterling said, "We have a compliance violation that could expose the hospital to federal scrutiny." By 2:06 a.m., Sterling had called Conrad and Pierce as well. 3 board members. 3 conversations about liability. 3 mentions of Katie's name. The external investigator arrived by dawn, a woman named Reeves with steel-grey hair and a folder already thick with every chart Katie had touched in the past 6 weeks. Sterling walked her through the hospital like a curator in a museum of incompetence, pointing out protocols, timing sequences, the way Katie had documented, the way she'd assumed authority in the medical record. Concerning patterns, he'd said, suggests overconfidence. Possibly dangerous precedent. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling had already called the nursing director at 3:22 a.m. I'm concerned about her references, he'd said, his voice smooth as a knife through silk. No one seems to know where she came from. The gaps in her employment history. The way she moves, there's something off about her background. He didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. He'd just planted the seed, watered it with doubt, and watched it grow. By morning, the nursing director had 3 separate staff members scheduled to interview about Katie's fit with the hospital culture. Katie knew none of this when she arrived for her shift at 6:45 a.m. She knew only that John Doe was stable. The needle decompression had worked, the hiss of the angiocath releasing pressure, the climb of oxygen, the sinus rhythm steady and strong. She'd saved a life with her hands, remembering what her mind had spent 20 years trying to forget. She should have felt clean. Instead, she felt caught. The badge came off at noon. The nursing director and a man in an HR blazer met her at her locker. They didn't make her sit down. They didn't offer water or a moment to process. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the language of institutional power, patient safety violations, unauthorized procedures, scope of practice concerns. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and Katie accepted them the way soldiers accept orders. No argument. No explanation. No defense. Your employment is being suspended pending a full investigation, the director said. Her eyes wouldn't meet Katie's. They never did when they were delivering consequences to someone they'd already decided was guilty. Katie's badge came free from her pocket. The ID photo showed a woman she barely recognized, hair pulled back, expression neutral, name tag reading Katie Morrison, RN. 20 years of careful construction. 1 night of muscle memory. Done. She cleared her locker in 8 minutes. The cracked mug from her sister, world's okayest nurse, went into a cardboard box. The dying succulent that had somehow survived 3 apartment moves followed. At the bottom, wrapped in her spare scrubs, was the photograph. Her SEAL team, 2004. 5 operators in desert camouflage, arms slung across shoulders, sun bright enough to bleach the desert behind them. Marcus was on her left, his grin wider than his face. He'd been 22 then. Young enough to still believe that training meant invincibility. She packed the photo last, her hand steady as she placed it on top of the mug. Sterling watched from 30 feet away, arms crossed, his expression a study in triumph, wearing the mask of professionalism. He'd done it. Methodically, surgically, through the machinery of institutions that existed to protect themselves first. Not through aggression, that was amateur work. Through policy. Through procedure. Through the careful activation of power that didn't require him to raise his voice or even break a smile. Katie carried the cardboard box down the hospital corridor at 3:51 p.m. No one stopped her. No one offered to help. Colleagues she'd worked with for 6 weeks suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. The hallway stretched out like a tunnel, and Katie moved through it with the same precision she'd used to perform the needle decompression, every motion exact, every breath controlled, her composure a fortress that didn't crack until she was alone in the stairwell. Even then, her eyes didn't water. Soldiers don't cry. That was the rule she'd written for herself 20 years ago, and it held. The rain started at 5:13 p.m., before she'd even reached the bus stop. San Diego rain was rare, and when it came like a broken promise, hard and sudden and wrong, drumming against the bus shelter's plastic roof like someone trying to get in. Katie sat on the bench with her cardboard box on her lap, the photograph visible through the opening where she'd packed it hastily. Around her, the city moved forward. Cars pulled out of the hospital parking lot. People rushed past with umbrellas. The world didn't pause for the erasure of a single person. She pulled the photograph out and looked at it in the grey light. Marcus's grin. Her own hand on his shoulder. A moment before, the IED in Fallujah's Jolan district had taken 3 of the 5 people in that photo. A moment before everything that came after, the PTSD that had climbed into her chest like a second heartbeat, the therapist in Coronado who'd said crisis intervention team after she'd called them at 2 a.m. with her sidearm sitting on the coffee table, the 12 years of choosing silence over explanation. She'd walked away from the Navy because staying meant drowning. She'd built this quiet life, night shifts, anonymity, the kind of nursing that let her help without being seen, and it had taken one comatose patient with worn boots and a combat badge to tear it all down. The rain hammered harder. Her scrub soaked through. Her cardboard box was beginning to soften at the corners, the mug shifting inside as the paper weakened. Katie thought about dropping it. About letting the rain dissolve everything back into nothing. She counted her cash at 6:38 p.m., $23.47. Not enough for a motel. Not enough for anything except the terrible mathematics of survival. A stranger offered an umbrella. Katie declined. She was still sitting there at 7:22 p.m. when she heard it, a sound that made her spine go rigid, a noise her body recognized before her mind caught up. The low thrum of heavy rotor blades, distant but unmistakable, the signature sound of a UH-60M Black Hawk cutting through the rain-soaked San Diego sky. Katie's head came up. The sound grew closer, not landing but circling, and she realized with absolute certainty that her carefully constructed anonymity had just expired. Somewhere in the hospital behind her, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and broken promises, John Doe had woken up. And he remembered. The rotor wash hit the parking lot at 0547, and the entire night shift felt it. Katie was halfway through her second cup of cold coffee in the break room when the fluorescent lights trembled like they might shatter, and someone's pager clattered to the linoleum floor. The Black Hawk descended through the pre-dawn darkness with the kind of purpose that makes civilians step back, its landing skids touching down in the ambulance bay with a finality that echoed across 3 city blocks. 2 Army Rangers emerged from the dust cloud, boots hitting concrete in perfect synchronization. They weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying authority. The kind that doesn't need explanation. They moved through the automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial with the fluid precision of men who had spent their careers making decisions in rooms full of brass and politicians, and their uniforms, pressed crisply despite the flight, patches identifying them as 75th Ranger Regiment, cut through the hospital like a blade through silk. The night administrator on duty, a man named Hendricks who had never been outside San Diego County, took one look at their eyes and picked up the phone to the executive suite. "Who are they looking for?" Hendricks whispered. Senior Chief Katherine Morrison, one of them answered. Not a request. A statement of fact. Where is she? Katie didn't know yet. She was in the break room, staring at her phone, at the text her mother had sent 3 days ago. "When are you coming home? Your father misses you." A text she hadn't answered. A text she had no answer for because home was Baghdad in 2004, home was a pair of worn combat boots, home was a child's face disappearing into the dust. The overhead paging system crackled. Katie Morrison, report to administration. Katie Morrison to administration. The break room went still. 2 nurses looked up from their charting. The coffee machine hissed. Katie set down her cup with a steady hand, stood, and walked toward the elevators like she had rehearsed this moment for 20 years. Maybe she had. The administrator's office on the 4th floor already had an audience. Dr. Sterling was there, his face the color of spoiled milk, standing beside the 2 rangers and a man in navy dress whites with 4 gold shoulder boards that meant he had spent for decades in the service of something larger than himself. A SEAL commander. The insignia on his chest read Task Force 121, and his eyes had the particular stillness that comes from having seen things that most people pray never to witness. Katie stepped into the room. The rangers stood at ease. The SEAL commander regarded her with the focused attention of a man studying tactical terrain. Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "Senior Chief Morrison," the SEAL commander asked. The title hung in the air between them like a detonation. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Katie's hands, which had spent 20 years moving through hospital wards with perfect control, stopped trembling. Not because she had regained composure. Because she was no longer trying to hide. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Katherine Morrison," she said. Her voice dropped half an octave. "Retired. How did you?" "Room 3 to 12, one of the Rangers said. "Patient in 3 to 12. You need to hear this." The medical floor was empty at this hour. Shadows pooled in the corners of the hallway, and the only sound was the distant beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of ventilators keeping people alive in the space between waking and whatever comes next. Katie walked toward Trauma 3, her badge clipped to her scrubs, the name tag reading only Katie in the same way unmarked graves read nothing. The man in the hospital bed was not a man in the hospital bed. He was a boy she had pulled from rubble on a street that smelled like burning concrete and copper. He was a child who had been sleeping next to his grandmother when the building came down, his small body limp in her hands as she ran, the Army Ranger combat badge catching the light of fires burning 3 blocks away. He was 8 years old and his name was Rashid and he wasn't breathing, and Katie, Senior Chief Katherine Morrison, had performed a field cricothyrotomy with a 14-gauge needle and a silk thread to get air into his lungs before the medevac could arrive. He opened his eyes and he knew her. The eyes were older now. The face was a man's face. The scar on his left temple from the concrete was still there, still the color of old rope. "Senior Chief Morrison," he said. His voice carried the same crisp precision as the Rangers. He had become what she had saved him to become. "That nurse is SCPO Kit Morrison. She saved my life in Baghdad when I was 8. Pulled me out of a collapsed building. Gave me oxygen with nothing but a needle and her hands. That's where the combat badge came from. She put it around my neck in the hospital before the medevac. Said I was a warrior. Told me to live like one." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Katie felt something break open in her chest, something she had locked away in a safe place for 2 decades, something that had been dying slowly, methodically, like a plant without water. One of the Rangers handed her a file folder. Official. Sealed. The kind of thing that changes everything. Inside was a DNA match. Official confirmation. Rashid al-Mansouri, presumed killed in action 2004, later rescued, later relocated, later enlisted in the Army Ranger program, later assigned to Task Force 121, later identified through military personnel records matching the SCPO who pulled him from rubble. The paper felt impossibly heavy, heavier than weapons, heavier than memory. Katie's hands trembled as she read it. Not from fear. From recognition. Her heart had known what her mind had spent 20 years denying. She had saved this man when he was a child. She had looked into his eyes and made a promise. And somehow, across 20 years and 2 continents and a life constructed entirely from silence, that promise had found its way home. The SEAL commander stepped forward. His dress whites were immaculate, he's bearing the kind of authority that comes from not needing to prove it. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of official recognition. Senior Chief Morrison served 12 years in Naval Special Operations, he said. His words carried like a liturgy. 3 combat tours. Fallujah. Sanjan Valley. FOB Shank. He paused. The pause meant something. Bronze Star with Valor. Another pause. A medal was a medal. But the way he delivered them made each one a punctuation mark in a sentence that was still being written. 2 silver stars. The room seemed to contract. Purple Heart. He let that word exist in the air for a full breath. And a second Purple Heart. She pulled off the most daring field hospital extraction in Operation Iraqi Freedom history. Helicopter came down in Jolan district. 12 wounded Rangers. No immediate medevac. SCPO Morrison set up a surgical station in the rubble under fire. Performed 6 emergency procedures with supplies she scavenged from the wreckage. Every single one of those rangers made it home. Some of them are still walking today because of her hands. He looked at Dr. Sterling with the particular focus of a predator that has been given permission to stare. Those hands. Dr. Sterling's face went from milk white to the color of ash. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The security footage you thought was deleted, said the FBI agent who was standing in the corner. Katie hadn't even noticed when he arrived, hadn't noticed when federal authority had walked into the room alongside military authority, was already downloaded. Every frame. The tray you knocked over. The chart you threw. The way you screamed at her. All of it documented. And then, when you called the nursing director, you said, and I quote, "I need to get rid of her before she makes me look bad. Get me anyone who can sign off on performance violations." Those are your exact words. We have the recording. The hospital IT director, a Marine veteran named Clayton, had done his work well. He had been waiting for this moment for 6 months. He had downloaded every frame of deleted security footage, had printed every email, had documented every instance of institutional sabotage. He had been watching Sterling destroy a decorated veteran in real time and had been waiting for permission to act. This was his permission. Falsifying an investigation to destroy a decorated veteran's career, the FBI agent continued, is a federal offense. So is tampering with evidence and witness intimidation. Sterling opened his mouth. His tongue moved but no words came. The Rangers didn't flinch. The SEAL commander didn't flinch. Katie stood in the doorway of the hospital she had tried to disappear into, holding the proof of who she really was, and felt the last 20 years settle onto her shoulders like a weight she was finally allowed to carry. 6 months later, Katie Morrison ran the newly established Veteran Services Program at Oak Creek Memorial, a department she had designed from the ground up. It had a trauma-informed protocol. It had funding from 3 separate Department of Defense contracts. It had intake forms that asked patients about their service history before it asked about their medical history. It had a waiting room decorated with photographs of the people she had trained, the people she had saved, the people who had somehow found their way back to her. Dr. Richard Sterling, by contrast, was teaching CPR fundamentals at San Diego Community College for $18.47 per hour. He flinched now. You could see it. Every time someone called him doctor, he flinched like the word was a slap. He moved through the classroom with the particular shuffling gait of a man whose authority had been so thoroughly dismantled that even standing up straight felt like a risk. His name tag at the community college read Steve. Not Richard. Not Dr. Richard Sterling. Just Steve. And when students occasionally recognized him, when they said, "Didn't you used to work at Oak Creek?" he would nod very quietly and excuse himself to prepare the practice mannequins. Katie's desk at the hospital displayed 2 objects side by side. The first was a pair of worn combat boots, their laces still tied, their leather creased from 20 years of patrols in a country that didn't exist on most maps. The second was a photograph of Katie in a dress uniform, standing beside a man in Army Ranger dress blues, both of them smiling with the particular relief that comes from finally stopping running. The man was Rashid. He had spent the last 3 months going through the official military records that had declared him missing. It had taken 14 months of paperwork and federal intervention and appeals to the right people in the Pentagon, but his status had been changed. Not from missing to found. From missing to never really dead. They stood together in that photograph like people who had finally earned the right to exist in the same space. His arm around her shoulders. Her hand resting on his elbow. Both of them looking directly at the camera with the kind of unguarded expression that people only manage when they have stopped being afraid of what they are. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. For 20 years, Katie Morrison had held herself so tightly that she had nearly disappeared. She had been so afraid of her past that she had constructed an entire identity out of silence. But silence doesn't protect you. It only delays the reckoning. Her fight was here now. In the hospital. In the Veteran Services Program. In the intake forms that asked people about their trauma before asking them to minimize it. In the understanding that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding the most weight. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've ever known someone carrying a secret that heavy, someone hiding in plain sight, someone whose past caught up with them when they were finally brave enough to help others, tell us their story in the comments. And if you've ever stood in a room where you thought you were alone and discovered you weren't, hit subscribe. Because there are more stories like Katie's than anyone realizes.